Joining us now, acclaimed political historian Julian Zelizer. He's the editor of the new book, The Presidency of Donald J. Trump, a first historical assessment. And I think before we begin and dive in, explain the premise of the book, if you could, sir. I think a lot of authors may think they have done an historical assessment of Donald Trump's presidency.
Well, I bring together historians to take a first draft in many ways at the history. And rather than rating a president, are they a 10 or a 0, I try to put it in long-term perspective. How do we understand the former president with relation to immigration, impeachment, all the big issues that shape the presidency? And I've been doing this now. This is my third president.
Okay, so how should we understand the former president as it pertains to the rule of law and the Constitution and undermining a presidential election?
Well, a lot of the authors in the book really look at how he strained many key elements of the democratic process. So we have a chapter on impeachment that raises the question, after this presidency is over, does impeachment really work? Is it a mechanism that is able to withstand the partisanship of our political system? And there's many examples of that where this presidency tested key elements of how our system is operating in this period.
All right. So, Julian, you write about an interview you did with former President Trump in an article in The Atlantic called What I Learned When Trump Tried to Correct the Record. You recount an incredible moment where he explains his version of the Capitol insurrection. When the Yale historian Beverly Gage brought up the president's relationship with the FBI and the intelligence community, the subject of her chapter in our book, he eventually turned to the Capitol riot of January 6, 2021. According to his memory, the expert opinion was off. The real story, Trump argued, has yet to be written. When Congress met to certify the Electoral College results, Trump told us there had been a peaceful rally, more than 1 million people who were full of tremendous love and believed the election was rigged and robbed and stolen. He made a very modest and very peaceful speech, a presidential speech. The throng at the Capitol was a massive and tremendous group of people. The day was all marred by a small group of left-wing Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists who infiltrated them and who were not stopped because of poor decisions by the U.S. Capitol Police when some bad things happened. These are words that he uses a lot, Julian, and he often does this, tries to completely change the narrative. I believe the January 6th Select Committee is going to be coming out with a point-by-point version of what went down. But what do you make of his complete contortion of the facts?
Well, look, he approached us. This was in July 2021. He had read an article about the book, and he asked if he could meet with us through his staff. And so we did via Zoom. And this was one part of the conversation where we're listening to how he perceived January 6th. And if you hear his words, it sounds like Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists are responsible for this. And Speaker Pelosi was the person who really failed the country. And this is what he does. He spins his version of events. He does it with force and in his mind with clarity, but they're at odds with what we all saw in front of our eyes. And that's what the work of the committee is at this point, so that people really understand how those horrible hours unfolded.
So, Julian, this is not the first dance you've taken with former presidents in writing this sort of a review of their presidencies, and presidents obviously have enormous egos, else they wouldn't become president. And I'm wondering, in your conversation with Trump, even though it's on Zoom and he's not there and present, what's your judgment in terms of his grasp on reality?
Well, it's hard to look into the mind of a former president, of former President Trump. But what I do know, and what everyone in the Zoom room could see, was the way he interpreted and spun his history was at odds with what most people understood to be true. And this ranged from his account of January 6th, was totally at odds with what we all saw on television, to his telling us that he was very tough on Russia. And even listening to those remarks again in the context of where we are today is just a president who's willing to say what he wants to say and doesn't feel there are guardrails controlling his narrative of events.
And Julian, you kind of excavate a little bit a point that most certainly is true and has been discussed at some length, which is that, you know, he didn't cause Donald Trump the divisions that we see in our country right now. He exacerbated them. He brought them to the surface. He made it okay to say things that had sort of lied dormant: cruelty, racism, bigotry, you know, as sort of under the veil of anti-political correctness. So how did that play out over the course of his administration, just putting out into the open things that apparently a lot of people in this country were feeling and thinking, but were scared to say out loud until he came along?
Yeah, look, this is fundamental to the book, that the former president wasn't the product of what we saw. He was also a cause of changes in politics. And he was willing to play to those elements of the electorate at many key points of his presidency in ways which we've seen other politicians do, but they tried to do it more subtly. They tried to do it through code words. He was more comfortable playing to the extremists very openly. And part of what we look is how the Republican Party has changed since the 1980s and reached a point that we have seen from the Tea Party right through the Trump presidency, where this has all become legitimate form of political discourse. And this is now part of the conservative coalition.
Hey, Julian, so you're writing the historical assessment of Donald Trump, but his story may not be over yet. We know that he, if he jumps in, would be the Republican favorite to be their nominee in 2024. I won't ask you to rank him, which historians are asked all the time in terms of presidents, but give us a sense of, you place him in history, but also if he gave any clues to what his next act might be when you spoke to him.
Well, again, this was July 2021. It didn't sound like someone who was finished with politics. And hearing that conversation was someone very much eager to end the story on his own terms, meaning that's what he was doing with us. He wasn't letting us write the book and come away with what we found, but rather understand him. And for me, that's a politician who's not done. And look, I came away from that literally. I turned to the computer and said, he's going to run again. I don't know if that's true. That's just my assessment of what I heard. And he was a disruptive president. He brought all the most disruptive elements of our politics, from the way the media works to some of the political elements we've discussed, and brought them to the surface. And we're reckoning not just with the former president, but with the state of our democracy. And that's what we really need to understand.
Absolutely. And to conclude, this is what you write in The Atlantic about your takeaways from your meeting with former President Trump. Quote, during our hour together, Trump didn't have many questions for us. Even in his attempt to correct the record, Trump mostly didn't acknowledge or engage with informed outside criticisms of his presidency. He did, however, admit to having sometimes retweeted people he shouldn't have. And at one point he said, when I didn't win the election, phrasing at odds with his false claims that the 2020 vote was stolen. But his goal was to sell a group of historians on his side of the story. I'm looking at the list. It's a tremendous group of people. And I think rather than be critical, I'd like to have you hear me out, which is what we're doing right now, and I appreciate it. You go on to say he seemed to want the approval of historians without any understanding of how historians gather evidence or render judgments. The new book is The Presidency of Donald J. Trump, a first historical assessment. Julian Zelizer, thank you very much for sharing it with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.